Greetings, everyone. So welcome to our webinar tonight on What Now for Pro-European Politics. The purpose of this is because we're a community and we like to have discussions within the community and keep everyone on board. We wanted post-election to just have the opportunity to start discussing the very new environment that we suddenly find ourselves in. And so this is for you to hear from us as to what we're thinking is going to be happening at the moment. So, well, a bit of a recap on the election too. So the role that Brexit played in the performance of each of these parties, how will Brexit continue to shape our politics in the new government, and what are our opportunities, the pro-European campaigners over these next 5 years. And also we're going to weave into that through Jude a little bit of what's the view from Brussels on all of this new territory. So for this purpose, I would love to welcome on screen our panel of speakers for this evening. So we have at the top there, Jackie Jones. Now, Jackie is on the European Movement exec, and she is, well, she was during the election, Labour's candidate for, and I tried to pronounce this before, Ceredigion Preseli.
Ceredigion Preseli.
Ceredigion Preseli, God damn it. And she is a councillor for Whitchurch and Tongwynlais.
Tongwynlais. Well done.
Oh, God damn. So I did my best. I tried the pre-prep. After Jackie, we will have Nick here, so Nick Harvey, who is the CEO of European Movement. And he was previously a Lib Dem for Devon. Where in Devon was it? Was it North? Yeah, North Devon until 2015. He then became later on CEO of the Liberal Democrats. But while he was an MP, he was also part of the coalition government as Minister for Armed Forces. And we also have with us tonight Judith, it says here, Judith Curtin-Darling, who we know as Jude, and she was an MEP for the northeast of England until 2020. And I remember Jude from, I think it was the Labour conference in 2017, wasn't it, where she was giving a great talk on, and I collared her at the end, and then she told me some really fascinating stories about Brexit in the steel industry and the fact that Brexiteers have got the whole angle on it entirely wrong, because there have been times before where the EU actually rode to the rescue of the British steel industry when the president of the United States decided to put tariff barriers up to British steel. So anyway, those are our panelists, as it were, coming right up. After which, after listening to them, then there is an opportunity for you all to be throwing questions my way. So here are the housekeeping notes that I'm going to go through. First of all, you can start asking your questions now, the speakers, in the chat. Put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can in the Q&A session afterwards. When typing your question, please say to whom it is addressed. If you don't do that, then I'll just pick someone I think it's most suited to. We'll be bringing up the questions on screen during the Q&A, so it'll pop up on screen. It will be selected for me, and I will read it out in my mellifluous tones, and then it will be answered. This will start at around 7 o'clock, and we will try and wrap up the whole webinar at 7:30. And please also note that this webinar is being recorded. So this is streaming live right now on YouTube, but then it will be available as a fixed link on our YouTube channel from tomorrow, and we will send the link around for those who couldn't make it right now, or for those of you that loved it so much that you just want to delve back into it. Right, so please remove Nick and Jude, so that it is just, there we go, look at that magic. So it's just Jackie and myself on screen. Jackie, you get to go first. So you get to say all of your thoughts, and then if Nick and Jude have been having similar thoughts, then they just have to adapt, don't they? So to you, please, from your perspective, and your perspective includes yourself out there campaigning and blocking and hearing what people have to say on the door, on the streets. I'm glad you can make it tonight because it is quite knackering doing all of that. But what role did Brexit play in the on-the-ground responses of people to the different parties, as far as you can judge? What do you think it will mean, particularly at the local levels, for politics in the new government? And what do you think, as you know, part of our exec as well, for our campaigning going forward?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, Prananda, everyone. And before I forget, good luck England later, she said through gritted teeth, but never mind. So the first question, I think, merits the answer of it helped a great deal not talking about it in a very strange way for Labour, of course, because our motto, as you might have heard, is change, or was change. And that resulted in quite a lot of different conversations to be had. It depends on where you are in the United Kingdom, I think, about what role Brexit played within the Labour Party and with other parties as well, because not making it a Brexit election allowed different parties the room to maneuver to provide their answers for constituents, for voters, to put their case forward. So, for example, on the doorstep where I was in Ceredigion Preseli, it's a new constituency, 82 miles from top to bottom, took 2 hours to get from top to bottom. Ceredigion, which is 60% of it, was one of the few places in Wales that overwhelmingly voted to remain, whereas Preseli part is part of Pembrokeshire, which voted to leave by a large margin as well. So the conversations, even within a single constituency, could be different and were different in the different parts as well. What I found, though, in Pembrokeshire, which is the leaving area, is that overwhelmingly people were very happy with me telling them that I was an ex-MEP and that I was very pro-European and very internationalist. They actually applauded that in the hustings, which I wasn't expecting. But on the doorstep, it didn't really come up. But later, I would divide that into two, really. That's the first part of the campaign. And the second part, when reform was surging, and it really did surge, it came fourth in Ceredigion Preseli, which is unusual. It usually came second or third across the United Kingdom. More conversations were about Brexit, and they were the Conservative candidate was more of a paper candidate in our constituency, even though the bottom half of it would have been a very strong Stephen Crabb, who had been the MP, Conservative MP for 20 years, although he wasn't standing in that constituency. I think it left a lot of room to manoeuvre, especially for the Greens, for Plaid Cymru, and for the SNP in particular, and obviously SDLP in Northern Ireland as well. So I think it had a huge effect, but because it wasn't really talked about, if that makes sense. So for shaping Brexit for the future, now, as I said, the catchphrase is change for Labour, and I think you've already seen within the last 3 or 4 days how Labour Party policy has changed. There were hints of it before, and I kept saying to people who were pro-Labour that just bear with us, bear with us, bear with us. And I think you can see that change already. So the first visit of David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, was to Germany and to talk to the Germans and to see that it was to renew, to reshape the relationships. I want to say two more things, and then I'll just leave it there. So Nick Thomas Simmons, I believe, has been appointed as part of his role as European Affairs. He's from Wales, very strong ex-barrister, and that reflects, I think, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the Welsh Government attitude towards Brexit has always been very different to the UK Labour one, which is that the Welsh Labour government has always been very much in describing how Brexit has ruined various relationships, has been very problematic, not just for trade, but for student relationships and exchanges and all of those things. So there may be a softening there, and I think very much so, especially when you think about the agenda that we've got for government. And you can't do quite a lot of these things that we've said we're going to do, which we will do, without having a better relationship with the European Union. And we'll see that over the coming weeks, I think. I mean, we mentioned steel earlier. Tata Steel is a classic example of that. But student mobility, the higher education is in terrible trouble. The veterinary agreement that will come, I'm sure, GB Energy, wealth creation, all of those things, Border Force Command, they all have elements of getting a closer relationship. And let's not forget the TCA, which is up for, well, not renewal, but looking at in 2026. So that's my opening remarks. Is that all right?
Yes, that is all right. Thanks so much, Jackie. Right, let's zoom you off screen and zoom in. Nick. No, that's Jude. There we go. So Nick's, I think, particular angle on this, apart from being our CEO, is that he's a Lib Demmer. And you can take Nick out of the Lib Dems, but he's still got Lib Dems in his heart and stays in touch with all of them. So has his ear to the ground on the Brexit dynamic with regard to that party and their fortunes. So Nick, same kind of questions. First, analysis of the election, particularly from the Lib Dem perspective, and then on to what you think the next 5 years are going to look like in terms of what's going to feature and what our opportunities are going to be.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. And in terms of the election campaign we've just seen, I know that many members of our movement would have loved to have seen Labour and the Lib Dems and others talking about Europe a great deal more, but Labour and the Lib Dems in particular took strategic decisions not to. And actually, when you look at the results that both parties have achieved, you've got to reflect that they got something right. And the reality is that the public on the doorsteps were not talking about Europe to the extent that we would like them to. The cost of living, the legacy of Liz Truss and her catastrophic mismanagement of the economy and the impact that's had on people's mortgages, the broken public services, the state of our economy. These were the things on the voters' minds, and a smart political party meets the public where they're at, not where they would like them to be. So I think the results speak for themselves. That having been said, I think Brexit was more of an issue at the election than it might immediately appear to the naked eye. The outcome of the election was a resounding removal of the Conservative Party after a disastrous few years. And although there are the more high-profile failings, their mismanagement of COVID, the Liz Truss mini budget, as I've said, the reality is that since 2016, they have wasted an awful lot of time, energy, and bandwidth on the whole Brexit saga. Not only was the decision itself to hold the referendum catastrophically ill-judged, not only was the conduct of the Remain campaign spectacularly mismanaged, but actually after the changing of the guard that came post-referendum, they have contrived, in my opinion, to make the initial blunder worse by the ridiculous manner in which they have sought pointlessly to divide us from Europe at every twist and turn of the detailed negotiations. And for that, we can thank Lord David Frost in particular. But I think that when the public made up its mind at the election that they'd had enough of the Tories, the part that Brexit actually played in that was much bigger than may be immediately apparent. We've now got a sweeping change across Parliament. We've got a Labour government with a huge majority, basically the same majority that Tony Blair had in 1997. What can we expect? Well, I don't envy Keir Starmer the inheritance that he has picked up. It's very different from what Tony Blair inherited in 1997. Public finances in a desperate state, public services wrecked, and the economy bumping along in a very unhealthy way. There's an awful lot for the new Labour government to be getting on with and doing. And the challenge is made all the more difficult by the distance that we have put between ourselves and our principal export market with our friends and neighbours in Europe. I know Labour have an awful lot that they've got to spend money on. They're pinning all their hopes on economic growth. That is going to be difficult if they've ruled out tax rises, ruled out borrowing other than for investment, and they're not prepared to try and make steps to move us closer to the European market. So the reality, I think, is that they're going to have to. I'm not expecting handbrake turns. I don't think they can do that. I don't think they should do that. And the voters are, as we know, pretty disillusioned with politicians who say one thing and do another. So I think it's an unreasonable expectation that Labour are suddenly going to make an about turn on the European issue and do something different. But I have felt ever since I took this job on a year ago that this election would be an inflection point. It would be a turning point. It would be a fork in the road. And that if the country got it right, which they have, it would be a complete new chapter in the European story. And that I'm certain it is now going to be. Jackie has referred to David Lammy in these first few days in office, getting over to Europe, talking to some of our friends over there, putting a much more positive image of the UK into the minds of our European friends. He has talked himself about the need for a security pact with the European Union. I think we should expect the government to interpret security in quite a wide way, not just the traditional defense sense of security, but economic security, environmental security, security against crime and cybercrime and international gangs and so on. I think that this is a vehicle through which they will do as much as they can to repair some of the more egregious damage that has been done to our relations with Europe. Now, our own policy advisor, Mark English, has produced an excellent inventory of things the new Labour government could do to try and improve our relations with Europe, to try and put right some of the more practical problems that Brexit has thrown up, and all of this without breaching its red lines. As it happens, the Centre for European Reform has come up with something very similar, and I think this is a plan of action that the new government will be very well advised to be looking at and working through, because there are a whole load of things that can be done that don't breach their red lines, but could materially improve our relationship with the European Union. And I think that each time the British government, our new Labour British government, sits down with European partners, looks at the practical issues that Brexit has thrown up, finds a pragmatic, practical solution that resolves one or other aspect of that, and is then prepared to own that solution and face up about it to the British public, the reaction on the part of the British public will be a positive one and a very welcome reaction, and they will see that sitting down and working with our friends and neighbours has a beneficial outcome for everyone. And each time that happens, we'll normalise the European issue in our politics, we'll improve the relationship with our partners, but we will make it more and more and more possible to discuss the European issue, a pathway back to a closer relationship with them. And I think that by a second term of a government, we could be looking at a much more ambitious programme for repairing the relationship than perhaps is possible right now. So I think this has been a brilliant outcome for pro-Europeans. I think a House of Commons with a huge Labour majority, a big contingent of Liberal Democrats, plus Greens, Plaid, SNP, lots of individual Labour members, all willing to pick up and campaign on the European issue. Mercifully, despite the fact that Farage is there and a few of the hard right Tory MPs have managed to cling on, the centre of gravity on this issue is in a very, very different place. So for the European movement, with our step-by-step strategy, which we're going to revise and refresh shortly, this is the moment at which that comes into its own. While we've had a Tory government there that didn't want to repair the relationship with the Europeans, it's been quite difficult to make progress. We've done our best to campaign on specific issues and show what the problem is. Now we've got a positive and pragmatic government, we can move on from simply highlighting problems to looking for practical solutions. And each time we get one of those practical solutions from a government acting in good faith, we will move closer and closer back towards our European destiny and our objective in the movement of rejoining and getting ourselves back to the heart of Europe. So I'm hugely encouraged. I think the tactical decisions that the parties we were looking to made have proved to have been well judged, and now is a completely new political arena in which we will find ourselves campaigning with renewed hope and optimism and expectation over the years to come that we really can achieve our objectives. So I'm absolutely delighted. I'm full of great enthusiasm and hope for the future, and I hope all of you will be too.
There we go. I was wondering when I was going to be put back on screen. Good. And I like that optimistic twist at the end. That's exactly how I'm feeling. It feels like a whole herd of dinosaurs have been either removed themselves or been extracted, and in its place that we've got, you know, a sweetie shop of all of these different things that instead of complaining about, as Nick says, you know, we can pick up and say, look at that. Yeah, that's great. Love it. Okay, what's that over there? Let's go get that. And it feels like we can enter a phase where we're looking at the positives and just collecting and banking the good stuff. And I think that's going to make a big difference to our momentum too, especially with the Parliament full of young MPs that also want to make a difference. I can see tons and tons of potential partners there. So thanks ever so much for that, Nick. Now swipe him away and swipe in Jude. There we go. Hi, Jude.
Hi.
Before this, Jude was saying, you know what, Jackie and I are so much on the same page that there's a real risk that we just copy paste of each other's minds. So what Jude's going to do is plug us into these questions, but with the optics and the slant predominantly from the continent, specifically Brussels, because that's the real seat that we need to connect with in terms of where all the thinking is. So yeah, take it away, Jude. What did our fellow Europeans make of our last few months, and what do they make of our next 5 years?
Well, I think I was glad that I prepared to do this slightly differently, because I agree with a lot of what Jackie said, and also, to be fair, a lot of Nick's analysis as well. I think it's fair to say that the rest of Europe has been watching this box set of the Brexit implosion in the Tory party now for years, with a mixture of bemusement, but at times frustration, at times total embarrassment about the way the discussion's going. So the reaction in Brussels was very much, oh, thank goodness, the adults are back in charge on the island. And I think it's important to say that there's also a lot of recognition that there was a lot of people working to maintain bridges through the last few years since 2016 to avoid, and particularly since 2020, to ensure that the bridges weren't completely burnt in the Tory psychodrama, and that relations could be put back on track relatively quickly. And I think actually that's what we're seeing. And I think it's also worth saying, others didn't say this, so I'll just add it to the mix, that because there is, even if there is a concern about the electorate, and in regions like my own, there is a concern that the reform vote was still very high, and that Brexit is potentially an issue which could re-emerge into the debate. You don't have the same divisions within the other parties that exist within the Conservative Party. So the topic of Brexit isn't divisive inside the political parties, which also I think will allow a kind of more mature discussion in the UK and in Westminster. And when Brexit appears, it's an issue which divides the opposition and the Tories. There is likely to be a lot of sparring between Conservatives and Brexit Party MPs, and it's a question of whether that happens to one side and how much that pollutes the debate in Westminster. But Westminster is very different to the European Parliament, as Nigel Farage will shortly discover. It's not the same platform that he had in the European Parliament, and so it's going to be quite interesting to see how they behave and how they're gradually perceived, because this could also be a period where they're exposed for the charlatans that they are, that Jackie and I know from having seen them up close in the European Parliament. I think it's also worth saying that what bodes in our favour is that generally opinion polls, particularly since 2021, have been overwhelmingly pro-European in the UK. So there's a bedrock on which to pursue the strategy that Nick just set out of pragmatic cooperation and owning the benefits of working with our neighbours in a mature and adult way. I also think, and Nick mentioned this towards the end of his statement, that there's something very clever has happened inside the Labour Party. So this very short motto or slogan, change, has played out in terms of the Brexit narrative in a really interesting way since the end of since the results, and just shortly before the election, in the shift towards a discussion about security. And I agree with what Nick said. We're not talking here about just a very narrow discussion about defence or European cooperation alongside NATO, or even support for Ukraine. But the way that this is being framed in Brussels and in all of the European press is that this is an open discussion about a broader notion of our collective security, our economic security, environmental security, security in relation to migration as well. And changing the narrative allows a different approach to the relationship. And that's important, because I think the other message, which has been heard very loudly and is very welcomed on this side of, and I'm based in Brussels, on this side of the Channel, is that there hasn't been the suggestion that we want to reopen the withdrawal treaty with the TCA, with the Windsor framework, and enter into a new, protracted, complicated set of negotiations, because there's basically no bandwidth on the EU side for that level of Brexit and negotiation. People were exhausted by the end of the negotiations. They didn't want to talk about it anymore, and they certainly don't want to talk about it now. But what they do want to do is to have a conversation about how cooperation can address the mutually important topics within that broad basket of security. So I think it's really striking that in the UK government delegation heading to Washington in the next few hours for the NATO summit, that you have the whole EU team also heading there to have conversations a little bit away from the public eye with all of their counterparts from across Europe to explore what this security relationship could be. Then the last point that I wanted to make, as I'm invaded by a small person, is that there's also a relief in Brussels that there's at last a recognition that the UK is part of the European region globally. We've had all of this discussion for years now about the Pan-Pacific partnership, about trade deals elsewhere, whilst the relationship with the EU has been allowed to deteriorate. And I think there's a recognition that now we can have a conversation about addressing some of the problems that we have in our trade relationship, whether that's the veterinary side, whether that's students. There is scope for that discussion, and definitely there is an openness on the European side to do that. So that's kind of the perspective from Europe. And then my last point would basically be, as pro-European campaigners, what is our role in this period? And there I agree with how Nick laid it out. I think that we need to build the consensus to row in behind all of these pragmatic, incremental reconstruction of bridges and agreements with our European partners to demonstrate the value that they have for different parts of British society, to be telling the good news stories far louder. This was also the lessons that we had during the referendum campaign, that the good news stories were simply not told loud enough and enough and as often as they needed to be. And so I think at the moment, the important thing is to avoid putting ultimatums or trying to divide what is a broad consensus, I think, in Parliament of the need for a strong, mature relationship with Europe, and to avoid, forcing responses which rule out different options further down the line, that put people into trenches that we then have to spend a long time getting them out of. With that, Mike, I'll maybe wrap up there, and I'm happy to hear any questions and answer any questions, but maybe I have to see what this coughing child behind me wants.
And what's this child's name?
This is Natan. This is a European Parliament baby. I was pregnant at the Brexit referendum. He appeared as a child of Brexit, and we're a Belgian-British family, so we live Brexit in every part of our family life as well.
Hi, Natan. So this little one was in the bath when we were getting ready to come on, and we were discussing the possibility that he might come charging through or go thumping around. But yeah. All right. So let me do a little wrap up there. Thanks ever so much for that, Jude. Really useful to know that essentially what we at this end of thought has been clever move by David Lammy is actually recognised as such in Brussels. And I remember when UK and a Changing Europe actually had a webinar about security frameworks, and they were asking the question, what's going to be the legal underpinning of all of this? And they weren't sure. And I had a conversation with Anand after, in which I said, I don't think it needs any. I think the main thing is the optics, that you're actually saying to the world, Europe's important, UK and EU are standing shoulder to shoulder in this new geopolitical reality, and it's about security and common interest, and we'll just collaborate on as much as we can. And that's pretty much now what David Lammy is saying. And he doesn't want to get into the, you know, the legal structures, because that's protracted negotiations, and the Commission doesn't have bandwidth for that, and they're changing the guard anyway. So it's all about repositioning and optics and showing that we're a trusted partner and that we've got shared values. And so that was my interpretation. So really good to hear that that's going down well on the other side. Right, so now it is your time to shine, audience, with your questions. And I know that there have been some coming in already, because Michael and Scott have been giving me a heads up about what some of the first ones are. So, Michael, could we have first question on the screen, please? All right, so it comes from Simon Lord. Realistically, what is the best way to influence Labour to become rejoin? Okay, so I will, and this is a big question, so I will let Jackie have a chomp at it, and then I'll let Jude have a chomp at it, because they're both Labour. Go, Jackie.
Thank you. I personally don't think it's a question of rejoin. I've argued this in the European movement as well, because it's a new relationship, and I mean that in the most sincerest and positive way possible, because it will be, because the European Union hasn't stood still. And it's moved on dramatically since even the referendum, or since we've left. So we have to take that into account. And security is the way in, as far as I can see. Security in the most broadest way possible, as Nick and Jude have outlined. And when you look at the government website, security is largely undefined, but relates to an awful lot of different aspects of what we've already got in the TCA, what we've got in the Windsor Agreement, what would be covered in the treaties, etc. So that's really important. I said this as a very mini MEP, you know, for a short time only, that we do have to have a national conversation before we go down this road. It's really vitally important, before the European Union allows us even to get to the point where we might be able to join, to settle the question. And that's a challenge. And I would suggest, because there are elections coming up in 2 years' time for the Senedd, for Holyrood. I don't know about Northern Ireland, whether they will have elections then, but certainly for possibly some mayors and local elections. And reform is gathering steam. We've got to have that conversation, especially about immigration and migration in particular, but lots of other issues as well. So I don't think it is about that. But one thing I do want to tell you is that the Labour Movement for Europe, if you're not aware, inside the Labour Party, there's an affiliated association, which also, of course, Jude and I are part of, on the Exec for Wales. They selected 47 MPs. So 47 MPs are openly pro-European. That's regardless of how many are not affiliated to Labour Movement for Europe. It's those individuals in particular who you should be talking to, writing to. But let me also put this to you as a candidate. There's no point in, I had one email every 5 minutes for 2 weeks from campaigns. There's no point in doing that at all, because we had strict instructions, I'm sure other people did as well, to not sign up to any pledges, etc. That is not the way to do it. It has to be done way, way, way further beforehand, and much more subtly and in a different way, to entice people to sign up to it. Like Labour Movement for Europe, I presume Lib Dems and others have that kind of thing as well.
Thank you. Yes, if you are a Labour Party member, then consider, of course, joining up to Labour Movement for Europe, because the more numbers they have, the more influence they have within the Labour Party. Jude.
Yeah, well, and inevitably, I agree with what Jackie's just said. I think there's also in that sense that the EU has not stood still. The options are wider than just rejoining what we left. For a start, what we left is not on the cards anymore. I think that's very clear. The kind of a la carte package that the UK had previously, with a rebate, with the carve outs and opt outs on this, that, and the other. All of that would not be necessarily on the table. But what is emerging on the table in discussions at European level is this idea that Emmanuel Macron started of concentric circles of cooperation. And in the past, that has largely been limited to the European Economic Area, Norway, Liechtenstein, and so on. The question of the enlargement to the east and the Ukraine joining the EU has opened up a whole discussion about other forms of relationship in the European Union, and so as I said when I was speaking before, I think it's very important not to try not to push the Labour Party in particular into a kind of muscle memory position which stems from the Brexit debate.
Yes.
If we're only talking about single market customs union, will you rejoin this, then we will reawake the muscle memory. It basically brings the debate that we had in 2016 to 2020 back into the debate. That is a losing place to be talking. It's exactly what Nigel Farage wants us to do, because that is his playing field. So in fact, it's far smarter to think about how do we build a new relationship with the European Union. And at the end of that, in the 1970s, maybe it was still politically, or not politically, but socially unacceptable to live in an unmarried partnership. But I think in the 21st century, we don't necessarily have to walk down the aisle. We can find some very, very nice way of cohabiting with our neighbours, and still having a more loving relationship than we have today.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, that we know that Labour and the Labour leadership are really scarred by the whole Brexit thing, and it goes deep. I know campaigners in the north who have very visceral responses thrown in their faces, and so there are trigger words out there, and if we can start engaging with the public again through new lenses, new optics, break it down, weave it, present it as different bits from new ways, then you avoid, I think muscle memory is actually a brilliant term for exactly how they'll react if you hit the right/wrong pressure points. Right. I gave a big chunk of time to that question because that question is particularly important, but I know there's a whole load of questions queuing up. So for the rest of them, because we've got 15 minutes left, I want to go more rapid fire for them. So question 2. Elizabeth Baker asks, question specifically for Jackie. Do you think Labour is more concerned about right-wing media? Oh, this is a good question. Right-wing media reaction if it debates pros, cons of joining the EU than the voters. Here in the red wall, voters seem mainly neutral on EU. So yeah, the essence of the question is, what is it that Labour are afraid about? Is it the right-wing press or is it the voters on the ground?
I mean, there'll always be right-wing press. It's not favouring Labour ever. It doesn't matter what topic it particularly covers, I think. But when it comes to this particular issue, I'm not sure. I think Labour does a lot of focus groups, and so do a lot of political parties. Whenever this comes up, it is viewed quite negatively, is my understanding, although I'm not in those rooms, but that's what I've understood by it. The red wall voters are worried about immigration for right or wrong reasons. They're worried about the cost of living, etc. That came up much more than anything else. Cost of living, the NHS. So I think it would be unwise for any Labour government not to focus on those things rather than the EU at the moment. Let the top level discussions take place behind the scenes. Let's see where we can get to, and then let's move forward with that. But it's got to be a holistic strategy. I'll shut up there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So everything that we do as well should focus on real issues like opportunities and cost of living. Next question, please. From Mark. Genuine question. Why do people think PR electoral reform is necessary to enable rejoining or join? Oh, I think we'll bring you in for that one, Nick. You will have to unmute yourself, though.
Sorry, I thought that was all happening automatically by magic. I think the problem is that when we get to the point that the EU, that we're ready to knock on the EU door about coming back, they're going to want to be absolutely confident that it's the settled will of the UK that it's coming back. If it's still a schism down the middle of the UK, we're not a very attractive proposition for the Europeans. They're not going to want to resume spectator status in the, as I've called it, the in-out, shake it all about psychodrama of whether Britain wants to be in or out. We're only fit applicants at the point that it's clearly the settled will of the UK that we want to go back in. Now, the problem is, if you've got a Labour government that at some point in the future applies to join, but you've got a Conservative opposition saying, well, if we win the next election, we're coming straight back out again. Do you know, they've almost got an effective veto because we're just not fit applicants if we're in that state. So this is where attention begins to turn to proportional representation. We're one of very, very few countries in the European continent who sticks to this prehistoric first past the post voting system. And if we could shift to a proportional system, that would be another way of convincing our European colleagues that we're capable of amassing a sustainable majority on the issue. So I've often said before that the pro-European campaign in the UK has got to deliver either the Conservative Party or PR, or better still, both, if we want to be confident of getting back in as full and fit members.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get into power on 34, 35, 37% of the vote, then it makes our colleagues nervous, doesn't it? But if you've got a stable majority in the public of 65% that want in, and you've got PR, then there is no way that a pro-Brexit minority can actually jump in. I see Jackie putting up her hands, but I want to go rapid fire through the questions. Next question, please. Question from John. Why did Starmer say no rejoin in his lifetime? Is he not expecting to be alive PM for long? Oh, there's a little side dig with that. Okay, Jackie, I'll throw it to you and you can say what you wanted to say and then handle.
I want to say,
talk about what Starmer said that I know annoyed a lot of people.
The PR question, because in 2016 in the Senate race we had a formal list system, and 7 UKIP members were elected to the Senate. So I just note a caution that with reform, rebuilding, and what's happened in France as well, please do. I mean, it's nuanced. It's a very long conversation, that. So that's all I wanted to say for that one. I don't know why he said it, and if he said it, obviously I disagree with him. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those of us that are in Labour, and I'm a Labour member too, when it ever gets thrown at us, but Starmer said this, our answer should just be, well, not my problem. You know, if he says something that's patently really difficult to maintain, that's not our problem. The weight of public opinion will make demands of the government anyway. All right, next question. Linda asks, how can European movement best empower pro-Europeans within the Tory party? Good. Thinking ahead to their conference, what will be the most helpful messages to convey there? Good question. Jude, do you want to take that one?
Well, I can. I also, in the tradition that Jackie started, will say a word on the last question because we're breaking your rules. But I think that it's a really good example of the muscle memory response. If you push and the question pushes the Labour Party into a corner, the danger is the muscle memory results in a response which is not helpful. So that answer, I think, should be seen as an example, a concrete example
he
of
was
that.
backed into a corner on it.
Yeah.
Because they were saying, how about in your lifetime? So
Yeah,
it was
exactly.
nudging him for something. And
they wanted a headline and he refused to give it, but unfortunately it gives another headline which irritates a whole raft of other people. In terms of the Tory party, well, look at, since Linda said that she's an LME member as well, this is Labour Party members trying to influence the Tory party. But one of the effects of the Johnson years in the Tory party was the hollowing out of the membership and the hollowing out of the kind of old school One Nation Conservatives. And I think that there's a choice now that group of people in the country have about whether they want to take back control, ironically, of their party, because the Tory associations in many places shifted radically to a hard Brexit position, and people left the Conservative Party because of that shift. So it could be that there is a strategic decision made, and as I understand it, that's one of the things that happened in Liz Truss's seat, where the kind of One Nation Tories, David Gauke and others, got in behind a local farmer who was pushing a more moderate Conservative position, which resulted in Liz Truss losing her seat. So maybe there is organising going on inside the Conservative rank, the wider Conservative ranks, if you like, to rebuild the party after what has been an absolutely disastrous period for them. I think it's shown the real dangers of pandering to the far right. The reform, UKIP reform, whatever you want to call them, I mean, it's in many cases the old BNP as well. They are political cannibals. If you let them start eating out the interior of your party, and this is something that Labour is going to have to be very cautious about, then they will just eat more and more and more. And I think that's also what people are learning in France and elsewhere, that you have to actually draw a line in the sand, differentiate yourself and set out a different vision for people. I hope that, because even though I'm Labour through and through, I think it's very important that we have a balanced political debate. It's not healthy for a country not to have proper opposition. We need a sensible Conservative party, but sensible Conservatives have to rebuild their party from the inside out, and that will potentially be a very long-term process of kind of taking out the cancerous cells. That's a very offensive term to use, but that's how it feels from having watched from the outside.
I would, by the way, a little factoid here, a little bit of knowledge with regard to Liz Truss. At the PopCon conference yesterday, one of the people announced that it was David Gauke and Dominic Grieve that ousted Liz Truss. To which David Gauke replied, "Oh, that's very flattering, but I don't think either of us particularly bothered," or something along those lines, something nicely dismissive. But also that the young Conservatives coming through around Westminster and Whitehall lot of them are actually very pro-European, that young band, and they've been keeping their head down because they know that Brexit's done nothing for their future. And so I think there's probably quite a bit of hope in a new wave of really politically connected sensibles that want to come through. Right, brilliant. Thanks for that. Next question from Peter Burke. Question for Nick: is Erasmus back on the table?
I mean, I think, Peter, that we would be well advised to pick up the Erasmus cause and run again with it now, because I think that this is one of the issues that I was talking about earlier, where a pragmatic solution could be found relatively quickly. And this is one I think I would expect the new government to be quite sympathetic to. And I think it's one that the EU would respond to quite positively as well. I mean, remember, Erasmus as a program is open to non-EU countries more generally, not only the UK knocking on the door. So, I mean, we're working with the grain of the program if we try to get back to this. And my own view is that this could be quite an early win for the new government and would be one of those sort of small incremental steps I've talked about that would take us along the road. So yes, we're ready to give this another punt.
I would add two things here. Firstly, if you see Sir Patrick Vallance today has been gunning hard on the importance of science, and you see that also from the new Labour Party and Keir Starmer himself, and Tony Blair has been doubling down on this. I think that they're going to go big on R&D, and that means pro-universities, which is pro-Erasmus. But also what we must do is sing up the part of Erasmus that is not universities and that is much more working class in bandwidth. And that's actually the part that has been expanded by the EU recently. And I think people need to know that of all of that part of the programme as well. But I think on those two routes, there's real opportunity there. Right, next question. We're getting close to the end, so I'll take two more questions. This one, then one following that, and then we'll wrap up there. Simon, again, question for any of the panel. Are there any plans to rejoin Creative Europe for the current government? Creative Europe provides a lot of funding for projects in the creative industries. Who wants to have a pop at that? Put your hand up if that's your kind of bag. No, says Jackie. I would have thought this would be your kind of deal. Jude? Jude will have a pop at it.
I think this is the kind of area where there's been very little attention, with the exception of the damage that Brexit's done to performing artists and the kind of stories of theatre companies or community arts companies and so on. There's been relatively little debate around the creative industries, and I think it's also, it comes back to the point about science and Erasmus. It's the kind of area where you can build a different narrative about the logic of strengthening relations.
Yeah.
And it strengthens the broader, I mean, the benefit is that you then are dealing with also questions of kind of soft power, where you build the basis for social acceptance and public and that broad public acceptance of a closer relationship. So I hope that within the culture team, they're looking at how to rebuild those and what the kind of international dimension is for the creative industries. But it's a very specific question. I think it's I've not heard anything specific in Brussels, but then as I said right at the beginning, many organizations have maintained the bridges in the last few years, and the creative industries have been one of those sectors of the economy where the bridges have been maintained, relations have been maintained, and so I think it's probably kind of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. And it's very, very useful that this new government has come in now, because if we had to wait another parliamentary term, so much more divergence would have happened and so much more would have been starved out in terms of the living links that we maintain. Okay, last question. Throw it at me, Scott and Michael. What have we got? Liz asks, we're not hearing much about the possibility of rejoining the European Economic Area. Would this be worth exploring? Jude shaking her head, so she says no. Do you want to add anything on to that before I ask anyone else?
I mean, I think the reality is that you would have to have the acceptance of the EEA members, and the Norwegians have, even though the Norwegians generally, oh, you mean the European Environment Agency or the European?
Yeah. Well, that changes the answer.
Okay,
Sure.
sorry.
Yeah.
So the if it's the European Environment Agency, then that's a slightly different conversation. I think it's really interesting that under the surface, I'm not sure whether this is in any way broken the surface in the UK debate. There is a conversation going on about the chemicals regulation and about the REACH package, which has cost an awful lot of money, billions for UK chemical sector to try and replicate the European framework. I'm not sure that there would be rejoining of a European agency, but certainly very much stronger relationships with European agencies. I think that's really likely within this this new relationship. But sorry, I'd misunderstood. Oh my! I apologise if there are any Norwegians online who now I've had a complete pop at the Norwegians accidentally.
No, if I could add 2 sentences to that, you have a look at alignment, and you can see already the alignment is starting to get a little bit stronger. What's the evidence of that? It's the bee pesticides directive. Well, the edict that came out of the Labour government. Oh, I love saying that. Sorry, a Labour government that said you've got to stop having pesticides that kill bees. And that aligns. It's just a small step, but I think that's what we'll see. Tiny, tiny steps like that. And that's about chemicals as well.
Yeah, and before you can click together, you do have to line things up. Nick, would you like to have the last word before I banish?
Well, I confess that, like Jude, I had misread that question as relating to the European Economic Area.
Well, I was the one that read it out that way, so same lies with me. Yeah.
I would like to push this, and I think it's something that would be popular with the public. And I mean, I don't know whether pushing to get back into the agency is something that's possible quickly. I don't even know if it's something that a non-member state can even join. It can probably be an associate of some sort, but broadly, the closer we can get ourselves to the 35 or 6 European agencies that there are, the better, and the smoother the glide way will be when the point comes to start knocking on the door and talking about joining again. So I hope the new government won't rule out trying to rejoin agencies. I haven't heard them do so to date. It will differ. The rules for each of these organizations will be slightly different to each other. It won't be possible to join some. It will be possible to join the others. But even where it's not, some sort of an associate agreement is possible. And these are just the sort of incremental steps I've been talking about, where each time we do it, you normalize the whole European issue and just detoxify the politics of the European issue. And in answer to the question somebody put earlier, how do we encourage Labour to get to the point about joining? The more we can shift the politics and the more we can amass clear, sustainable majority of the public for it, the easier it will be for them when they're looking at their programme for the second term to be bolder than they were in their programme for the first.
Thank you very much, Nick. And now banish the panelists from the screen so that I may wrap up for the audience at home. Thanks very much for joining us for this webinar. We're a few minutes over time, but you can see just how many things there are to talk about in a very positive light of all the things that we can go out and rebuild with and grab and open opportunities with. So this invitation for this webinar went out to members only because we wanted to keep it close for you guys. But this membership, we also really want to grow because that helps not just sustain us, but it helps us build the local structures and local groups. And at the end of the day, if we want to make this whole society move that we're actually advocating here, we do need to build out who we are right across the 4 nations and in all the towns and cities and regions. And so now is a really productive time for us to grow in our relationship with the new Parliament, with all the businesses that feel as though they're free to speak again, and the NGOs that feel free to speak again. So everything that you can do to help us go out and spread the word, get new members in, participate in our local activities, the more the better. This really is now, we've come in from the cold and it is our time to grow. So thanks for being with us, and let's all enjoy the next phase together. Thank you very much and good night.